I've been involved in basic research at my university. I've lectured. I've also been in national policy development. So I have seen for a long time how the idea of diet and health supposedly work together, to create good health. And finally, after all that complexity, I end up with two fairly simple ideas. And that's what I'd like to share with you today. I started out in part of the plan. Okay, yeah, I started out on a farm actually. Gosh, and that's really important. I started out on a farm milking cows on a dairy farm actually, and then I eventually went to graduate school and did my doctoral dissertation on promoting the consumption of more animal protein. You can see it on the left. This is my degree. That was consistent with the production and consumption of dairy cows. I mean, milk from dairy cows. It was consistent, of course, with also the consuming meat and dairy, the typical thing that we do on farms. Then a little after that, I eventually was at another university, Virginia Tech University, and we had a State Department project on feeding malnourished children in the Philippines. And so that's when my career really started, because in the Philippines, the question concerning malnourished children in the world, the main thing that most nutritionists believed that needed to be done was for these children to get more protein. And that usually meant more animal protein. So with my background, being from the farm, also being in the graduate school itself, promoting the consumption of more animal protein, this all was very consistent. However, there in the Philippines, I learned from my medical colleagues that there were children in the Philippines who were getting liver cancer. And I had the impression, it was only an impression, I had the impression from some of the information I had that the children who were most likely to get this liver cancer, which is fairly common in Asia and Africa, as you may know, the children most likely to get the liver cancer were the ones consuming the most protein, especially the Western kind of protein, animal-based protein. So then I saw this paper here in 1968 that came from India, where these researchers were showing in an experimental animal study that when they fed these animals 2 different levels of protein, and they were given, for example, a chemical that started the cancer. So when these 2 groups of animals were fed 2 different levels of protein, 20% of total calories or 5% of total calories, the ones that fed 20% of total calories, 100% of the animals got the protein, whereas the ones fed the 5%, none did. I mean, this was a really remarkable effect. It was consistent with my suspicion of what I was told about the children. In other words, increasing protein increases cancer. That was really a very difficult proposition for me because, quite frankly, I didn't believe it at first, coming from my background. I didn't quite believe it, but it was important. So what I had to do at that point was to organize a research program at my university back in the United States to actually investigate this question. Is it possible that protein can have an effect on cancer? That's where really my career started. And so much of my early work, which involved many students, many graduate students and postdoctoral students, much of my work really was designed to either deny or confirm this idea that animal protein supposedly could cause cancer. So we, as I said, spent many years on this question, and I'm going to show you here in this slide one of the more remarkable things that I saw in the very beginning. What this slide shows here is the development of cancer in an experimental animal model, development of cancer over the first 12 weeks on the x-axis. And this, of course, is the cancer index on the y-axis. So the study started with a mutation. All cancers start with mutations. So both groups, the 20% group, which you show here, started with mutation, and these animals have had 20% protein. The cancers are growing quite well. Animals fed 5% protein. In contrast, the cancer did not grow. It was really, as I say, quite remarkable. Then we did something else. We decided to see if we changed the diet during that first 12-week period. If we changed the diet, would that change the development of the cancer? When we gave them 20% protein, as you can see, the cancer is growing quite well. In contrast, the animals, then that group of animals was switched from 20% to 5%, and the cancer was turned off. These are the same animals. The animals starting here are the same animals as here. We put them back on 20%, cancer started to grow again, and turned off. So this particular demonstration here was quite remarkable because it showed that not only does nutrition control cancer growth, we could turn the growth of the cancer on and off. I mean, I found that really spectacular. I finally started to believe that, yes, it's true. Animal protein can turn on cancer. It also said something else that was quite important, namely nutrition, rather than genes, primarily control cancer development. That was a remarkable idea in those days and still is today, because in the cancer community, we mostly think of cancer being primarily determined by our genes, not by our food. And so what this demonstrated here, even though it was an experimental animal, and what it demonstrated, we can turn cancer on and off by nutritional means. And only animal protein, by the way, could do this, not plant protein. I'll show in a moment some of that information, but the animal protein was really the only kind of protein that could do this. So at that point in time, still searching for whether or not this is true, I wanted to determine what the so-called mechanism for this effect is. Obviously, if we see something really striking like this, then we want to know what the mechanism is. Incidentally, this question is very important in our area and our work, of course, because if we could determine what the mechanism is, by that I mean the biochemical mechanism, if we can determine what the mechanism is, then possibly we might be able to develop a drug to block it if we want to block it, or we can develop a drug to increase it if we want to increase it. So understanding the mechanism is a very important part of this discussion. Now, I'm going to summarize here what we learned over a period of about 12 years, actually, a number of students doing their doctoral dissertations on this, to be honest about it. What I'm showing here is a scheme that we used in cancer research to investigate the process itself. Cancer, we generally consider, has 3 stages. The first stage is initiation. That's when the normal cell is mutated. In other words, something is interacting with the gene in such a way it causes a mutation. And the second stage is promotion. This is when the cancers are beginning to divide. Most of these mutations, of course, are self-corrected. We have systems in our body that sort of reverse that. But in any case, some of those cells might be converted from a normal cell to a cancer cell. Now we have a little cancer cell, a new cancer cell. It starts dividing over time. And finally, we see it as a tumor. And then in the case of humans, we are diagnosed and we get cancer. So anyhow, this is the model that we use to understand how does this nutrition effect work? That's what I'm interested in, the mechanism for the protein effect, because if we can understand how it works, which mechanism is involved, we can make a drug. So consider the first stage here, initiation. We found out that the high protein diet increases, for example, the rate of entry of the carcinogen into the cell. Well, that sounded quite interesting. I mean, if that's what the high protein does, maybe we can find some way to block the entry of the carcinogen into the cell. The second thing is when the carcinogen comes into the cell, it is activated by an enzyme referred to as mixed function oxidase, MFO. That enzyme then will convert the carcinogen over to an active agent. It also converts it to a detoxified agent, but in the process of the enzyme working, some of the carcinogen becomes highly active. It becomes so active that it binds to the DNA, which is, of course, the part of the gene. In any case, the high protein diet also increased the activity of the enzyme. It increased the activity of the enzyme, the amount of the enzyme, actually. And then it also, the high protein diet changed the structure of the existing enzyme. When it changed the structure of that enzyme, the enzyme became more active. So now you can see here, we have three mechanisms. One, the high protein diet increases the rate of the carcinogen into the cell. Secondly, it increases the amount of enzyme that's present that converts the carcinogen into an active product. And thirdly, it rearranges the enzyme structure to do the same thing. Then we did the next study was to find out, well, what happens to the binding of the carcinogen to the DNA? That's what's required for mutation. We found out that the high protein diet increased the binding of the carcinogen to the DNA. In other words, the high protein diet increased mutations. Okay. But then under normal circumstances, we humans and most other species too, this kind of mutation is occurring all the time, but we have a protective mechanism. It's called DNA repair. That should be high. The high protein diet actually decreased the DNA repair. Surprisingly, it increased all these others that decreased this. And so here now we have 5 mechanisms. I couldn't tell which mechanism was the one that is the most important one. So we turned our attention to the second stage, that's promotion. In this case, what we found, again, the high protein diet actually decreased an immune system activity that is called natural killer cells that decrease the production of these cells here that are required to kill cancer cells. And so the high protein diet is doing that. And then it does some more things. And I won't spend time on all these different things, but to make one point, namely, the high protein diet increased 8 cancer enhancing mechanisms. That was fascinating. It increased 8 cancer enhancing mechanisms. And it decreases the 2 that really are important. And those 2 mechanisms are important. Sorry about this. So it increases 8, decreases 2. They all work in synchrony to show an effect. I saw this effect being quite remarkable because what this says is that nutrition, at least in this case, it doesn't operate by one mechanism. When something like a carcinogen comes into the cell or the protein is being changed, a whole lot of mechanisms are changed. And we only looked at 10. I had 2 more I could put here, but we looked at a certain number of mechanisms and every single one of them did the same thing. It turned on the rate of cancer development. Some of the mechanisms were increased, some were decreased, but that's beside the point. They all work together. This suggested to me a very different kind of nutrition definition. In other words, we think of nutrition being involving, single nutrients, each working on a single mechanism to affect a single outcome like cancer or heart disease or something like that. What this suggests is that we have a very different understanding of nutrition. Food is made up of many nutrients, hundreds, thousands of nutrients or nutrient-like substances. When we consume whole food, it's not one nutrient that we should be really concerned about. because all the nutrients are working together. And so with the assumption that somehow we can maybe change the activity of one nutrient through the use of a drug, it did not make any sense. So this was my awakening in a sense, and I'm sorry to go through so much basic biochemistry, but this is exactly what happened, and is what really could change my mind about what nutrition is. Nutrition is not about the effect of individual nutrients working alone. Now, of course, individual nutrients can be shown to have some effect, that's true, but that's not the kind of nutrition that generates general health for us in the long term. It's basically eating the whole food in order for nature to have access to all the nutrients in the food. And then in turn, our bodies determine which nutrient needs to do what. And all of that activity, enormously complex, that activity actually works in concert together. It works in a sense in unity. And I just thought that was fascinating. And over time, I came to realize that Western medicine itself, which is focused on the use of drugs, is also focused on the use of single chemicals. We make this presumption that single nutrients work, and that's how we supposedly understand nutrition. I disagree with that. We need to think about nutrition in a different way. We need to think about nutrition in terms of whole foods, and then sort of get a sense of what kind of whole foods really work. So now let me take you to another point that I made earlier, namely that the protein we were using to turn on the cancer was the main protein of cow's milk. That's why I told you I came from a farm milking cows, and that's what was so difficult for me to believe this. But the casein turned on the cancer. We tried soy protein and wheat protein. Even when they're fed to the higher levels of 20%, it did not turn on the cancer. So here was a very important difference between this animal protein casein on one hand with plant proteins on the other. Now, just to jump ahead a few years, I should point out that animal proteins actually do act very differently from plant proteins. This is true whether it's cancer or whether it's heart disease or whether it's other diseases as well. Animal protein is one kind of protein. Plant proteins is a different kind. And animal proteins actually tend to increase disease risk. Plant proteins do not. So now I just wanted to show you these slides, and then I'll stop for some questions to see if I'm going in the right direction. With this information here I just showed you, this is, of course, experimental animal studies. And the interest that we really had ultimately was, what does this mean for humans? Well, now I'm going to show you some evidence here on human studies. In this particular case, these are slides that I obtained recently, going back through the literature. And these are the results of studies by other researchers done years ago. But interestingly, they all show the same thing. As you can see here, these are observation studies, and all these points here on the graph are different countries. And so this study here was done in 1959, believe it or not. And so when this gentleman here looked at the relationship between, let's say on the x-axis, the amount of protein being consumed, in this case, animal protein, the amount of animal protein being consumed was associated with a dramatic increase in the rate of coronary heart disease mortality. So here's and I drew that what he just had. I made this a screenshot, and then I added the regression line, just using a very simple algorithm to make sure that all the dots are on equally distributed between the lines. You can see this regression line goes straight down, coming near the XY origin. That's for heart disease. This is animal protein and heart disease. Here's a case of animal protein consumption and kidney cancer, renal cancer or kidney cancer. In this case, as animal protein is increased, expressed as grams here, as is increased for different countries, you can see that the renal cancer or kidney cancer is closely related to the amount of animal protein being consumed. again, we see this sort of straight line, regression line, again, with the line coming down near the XY origin. Now here in later years was a study on prostate cancer. In this particular case, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. In this particular, the prostate cancer was related to the consumption of non-fat milk. Now, non-fat milk really is a protein drink because milk, for the most part, only has protein and fat in it. It obviously has other minerals and so forth, but mainly as far as energy is concerned, it has fat and milk, a tiny little bit of sugar, but not very much. So these researchers showed that an increased consumption of non-fat milk, in the United States, we call this skim milk. But in any case, an increase in consumption of non-fat milk is associated with an increase in prostate cancer. So these researchers said, oh, then we shouldn't drink non-fat milk, that's for prostate cancer. But I have a different interpretation. My interpretation is that they talked about non-fat milk, but in reality, it was animal protein. The same as we saw in the other two slides. So here again, I'm going to suggest that the animal protein increase is associated with prostate cancer increase. Now let's go to the fourth example. In this case, this is a study of breast cancer, still a different researcher. This was published in 1975, and again in 1985. This is a researcher here in the United States who was comparing the consumption of saturated fat with breast cancer for different countries. Now, saturated fat, as many of you may know, is primarily found in animal foods. So what he was able to show is that as saturated fat intake increases in different countries, then breast cancer increases. Again, this line, remarkably, it looks like a fairly good regression line going down right near the XY origin. In other words, the same thing as we see for these other diseases, for prostate cancer, kidney cancer, and heart disease. Now let's take one more. Here's a question concerning the consumption of dietary cholesterol. Here, I'm saying cholesterol, okay? Cholesterol, I think you know, is only found in animal foods. So cholesterol is, again, a representation of the consumption of animal foods. Now, the cholesterol consumption in this case is on the y-axis, the heart disease is on the x-axis. And so what we see here again, as cholesterol consumption goes up for different countries, as cholesterol consumption goes up, then the rate of heart disease starts to go up too. Notice here's Greece down here in the lower end at the time this was done. I can't remember, I think this was done in 1970, 50 years ago. The United States is up here near the top. So as we increase the consumption of cholesterol, apparently in Greece at that time, there wasn't much in the way of milk being consumed for sure, or not too much meat. But in any case, we see this increase in heart disease death rates as a function of cholesterol intake, okay? So they say cholesterol intake is a reflection of the amount of protein in animal foods. One more, here's colon cancer. Here's still every one of these are different researchers published at different times. They didn't talk to each other. They weren't comparing in that way. I just happened to collect them together and just in the last couple of years. It turns out that when we compare meat intake with colon cancer, another cancer, different countries again, different researchers, we see this really remarkable straight line relationship. See, keep seeing the same thing over and over. Here's uterine cancer. Uterine cancer is, once again, this was related to total fat. Now, total fat, when you compare total fat intake across the world, with different countries, the total fat intake is very closely related to animal protein intake. So I'm suggesting this is another indicator of animal protein intake. We see the same things. So here, now I'm going to summarize for you in this thing at the top. All of these things, whether it's low-fat milk, or whether it's meat, or whether it's cholesterol, or whether it's total fat, all of these things here are representations of animal protein. And unfortunately, when we do research, as it has been done, people will do research that says, okay, I don't want any more cholesterol, or I shouldn't eat meat, or which kind of meat. or they raise questions about the different kinds of fat or milk and so forth and so on. The research that has been done in the past in this field has focused too much on one nutrient as if it's the answer. I'm suggesting that all of these different ways of measuring food intake are representing animal protein intake. Now, I'm not suggesting that animal protein by itself causes the cancer or heart disease problem. It certainly has a major effect, that's true. But when we increase animal food intake, we automatically decrease the consumption of plant foods, which have all the antioxidants and so forth. So when we see a graph like this, a relationship between animal protein intake and disease risk in such a remarkable relationship, we're really talking about two things. We're talking about the consumption of more animal food and the consumption of less plant foods. So these regression lines really reflect more than just one thing. They reflect hundreds of nutrients all working together to create a variety of responses. And it turns out the responses I'm talking about are different diseases, all respond to the same thing. I actually found this idea here, and I'll stop after this. I found this idea obviously very different than the way I started my career. As I said, I started my career believing animal protein was good nutrient, which the more we have, the better off we have. But after seeing this, it was very clear to me, and with a lot of other data, I only just talking about 1% of the information we have, but what this really showed me was that consuming animal foods in order to consume the animal protein, which is supposedly good, supposedly it's high quality, consuming more animal foods means more health. That's what happens in various countries. And Anastasia, I think you'll appreciate this. You already know this. What turns out to be the case in different countries, the amount of protein that is consumed, or animal foods that's consumed, if you will, is pretty much a function of total income. Here's GDP per capita for these different countries. And so we again see the same relationship that I just showed you. United States is up here. I don't know where I see Greece on this. I can't see it here in this particular plot. But in any case, this is a straight line relationship. Increased income, increased consumption of animal foods. Now, I want to make a comment about that and I'll stop. Namely, I've worked in China, Philippines, other places. And one thing I noticed working in developing countries is that they don't have very much access to animal food, but they for sure want to get access to animal food because it's their argument that, look, that's what I was told, that you in the United States became very influential and economically developed because you had money and you could consume animal food. I actually heard that from my Chinese colleagues. And so they worked hard, and this was back in the 80s, to make sure that they consume more protein. And what I'm showing here in these slides is simply the fact that the more animal food we consume, supposedly to get that good protein, that's a mistake. That's a mistake. When we consume more animal foods, we are just, as we acquire income and money, then all of a sudden we're able in a position to supposedly get, wealthier and have more access to all the good things of life, when in fact it's not. It's actually the reverse. Okay, I'm going to stop here and let's take some questions, and we can go on later about that. Okay, hello, Anastasia?
Sorry, very nice.
Yeah, I stopped here just so maybe you said that you might want to have some questions, and I don't see myself on the screen, so I don't see you either.
Okay. I had my microphone closed.
Okay.
First of all, I would like to pose a question that I have seen from the students who have prepared a lot of questions. I will leave this with you, and then we'll see if somebody wants to say their question. I would like you to explain whether the concept of meat contains fish, whether we would see the same results if instead of low-fat milk or meat, we had fish in the axis. What do you think?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. If we had what in the meat or in the axis, I'm not sure what you said.
Fish consumption, fishes from the ocean, fish.
Oh, fish. Oh, yes. Yeah, but I did not work with fish, of course, but on the other hand, I have some colleagues who did. And the fish protein is the same, more or less, as land-based protein. So consuming fish, we're getting more or less the same kind of protein that we do with land animals. On the other hand, fish has a little bit of advantage, maybe because of the kind of fat it has. We call it omega-3, that's anti-inflammatory, as opposed to omega-6, which is pro-inflammatory. So on the fish question, there's one that can interpret that in the sense that maybe it's not as bad as meat, but quite frankly, fish doesn't have the antioxidants in it like the plants and so forth. And so I conclude that consuming fish is about the same problem as consuming meat.
How would you explain then that in some studies, people who substitute meat with fish, the fish eaters go better?
Yeah, well, that's right. And the reason I explain that is because, as I said, there are some parts of fish, for example, the kind of fat it has, it's anti-inflammatory. We call it omega-3 fats.
Yeah.
And so that's good. I mean, that's advantage. So the fish, when compared to meat, in some cases, and I only said in some cases, but in some cases, the fish may be an advantage. So I understand that. But I'm talking about in a broader context, of total health, for example. So if in my own personal life, we started changing our diets too, way back in 1980 when I started seeing this information, and we continued to eat fish. We also continued to eat chicken too, to be honest about it. And and I should say, and third, we continued to eat some cheese. So we did it, and after about 10 years and looking at the totality of the data, yeah, we just only ate plants after that. So
yes. Well, some people wanted to ask you how you you made the transition yourself, and what do you eat today? So
yes. Well, in 1978, 79, at that time, I was working on an expert panel with the government, and some of this information was becoming, a little bit of this information was becoming known, and I was on an expert panel and was actually given testimony before U.S. Congress, stuff like that, and I got a lot of attention, so I had to start thinking seriously about that. And, we had information at that time that was becoming convincing. So about 1980, we stopped eating red meat, and instead we ate chicken and we ate fish and cheese, as I said. Then during the 1980s, we finally dropped the chicken. I became more convinced of the issue. Then dropped the fish, and finally I dropped the cheese. That was about 1990. So it took us about 10 years. And my wife was very good about this in making the food, really continuing making it tasty. And we have 5 children. Now we have 11 grandchildren. All of us and all the spouses, 100% of us eat only plants. So it took us about 10 years to make the change. But there's another reason we also made the change. I just add really quickly. My father had heart disease. He was a farmer, but he passed away of heart disease when he was 70. He had a heart attack when he was 62. His brother died at 58. Their father, my grandfather, at 73. So in my own personal life, one could say I have the genes for getting heart disease. And I just noticed this effect of nutrition. So we all changed. My wife's family, the same thing, was cancer on her side. I'm now 88, she's 81.
This is great. I wonder, is there somebody who wants to raise their hand and ask a question which is relevant to what has been discussed so far, or shall
Yes.
we go on?
I can answer another question if you like, depending what you want to do.
Yes, let's see.
Anastasia, sorry, this is Mary. I send you a question directly to you.
Okay, do you want me to read it?
If it makes sense for you, yes, please.
Well, I don't see any other hands. Are there any hands? No. My
Okay,
students
well,
don't have so far. Okay, Mary, which is just talked, she has the following question. Did animal experiments show that cancer was on the rise in animals that ate animals, or in animals that ate plants? I guess she wants to ask, do animals that eat animals get cancer today because of their food? I think she asks about the pet food industry. Mary, is this correct?
Actually, I am trying to understand if an animal is in its nature to eat animals, then this animal, by eating animals, has cancer problems, and that was from all that is this happens all the time. I mean, from the beginning of the world.
I think if I can rephrase the question, she's asking whether or not animals that eat meat, for example, eat other animal flesh, if they have colon cancer and so forth.
Yeah.
No, first thing I should say, almost all animals only eat plants. You know, the big, strong animals, the animals that run fast like giraffes, elephants, cows, all those animals only eat plants. They don't eat meat. So, you know, the question it doesn't matter because they don't eat meat. The only animals that we know of that eat meat is interesting. The lion, you know, in the jungle, and just of course dogs and cats will tend to eat meat. But it's very interesting. Dogs and cats, when you give them the plant food, they actually become healthier. So even with dogs and cats, I don't know about the lions or the tigers, but they also eat a lot of plants. But all the animals that we associate with as humans, they don't eat meat. So the question is not really, I can't even answer the question because I don't know that animals eat meat, therefore whether or not to get cancer or heart disease, I can't say that.
Yeah.
I would like to come back to the protein question after Nicoletta. Nicoletta, would you like to give your question?
My question is that we all have heard since we were children that we should drink milk in order to get all the nutrients. Why an animal product that it is available to humans from such an early age has not been studied about its effects, and it's not has still replaced with almond milk, for example. Oh, I'm sorry because I didn't open my camera. I was speaking with clothes.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure your question. I'm sorry, didn't completely understand that.
Why the milk as a product is not replaced with almond milk to children?
Well, we should not be given animal milk. We should not be giving cow's milk to children. Number one, you know, a lot of people do that, and but it's not right because children who are fed with cow's milk, some of them actually, that's where type 1 diabetes starts. That's a long story. The protein in cow's milk creates an antibody in the infant, in the baby. And then that antibody attacks the pancreatic cells that produce the insulin. And so these children end up being type 1 diabetics for the rest of their lives. So feeding dairy to children is not right. It's not right.
But
there's other reasons too. Yeah.
But why is it still happening? I mean, we all have heard from our parents that you should drink all your milk in order to get all the nutrients. And I mean, this is a problem of our parents. This is a problem of our government. Why does this, it's not culture, but we are all in the same position since we are children. And if we want to change that, it happens because we want to change our way of life.
You know, you're asking a very important question. You know, I congratulate that. That's a really important question because it concerns, if I can interpret your question, it concerns why do our authorities tell us this? And why have they been telling us for so long? Number one, and my next comments, next slides, I'll show that. Number one, we have long thought that animal protein was high quality. That was a word. And so everybody wants to have high quality. I mean, obviously, we want to have high quality food. That is a very old idea. And it really permeated the Western societies, especially, well, all societies. Everybody wants quality, but in reality, and I'm going to show you in, I think, the next few slides, that is a mistake. And yes, I'm like you. You know, we also heard too, especially when I was raised on a farm. I was raised on cow's milk until I was, you know, I went away to school. I quit. I stopped. And so, as I say, I've already lived at least 20, 25 years longer than my father. You know, he had heart disease, and I didn't start changing the diet until I was about in my late 40s. Cow's milk is not good food. And I say that having been on the farm, raising and working with cows. But unfortunately, we humans across the world, any country, we tend to believe that we need to have that protein, that high quality protein. That's what makes us eat animal food, either subconsciously or consciously.
Okay. How would you define high quality protein? For you, which kind of protein you consider high quality?
Well, all animal proteins act rather like each other, not exactly, but as a group, they tend to act like each other, and they're all considered high quality, right?
Yes.
Plant proteins are considered low quality. Now, here's the difference. High quality proteins, what that means is a higher percent of the protein we are consuming is retained by the body. So in other words, it's the percent of the protein being consumed that is retained. That was thought to be a good idea because, you know, the protein that allows us to keep most of it, it's considered high quality. That's actually how it was designed over 100 years ago. And so everybody wants quality. Everyone wants quality. And so that word stuck with us. And most people didn't think about it. They just thought we had to have meat, we had to have it to get the protein. Also, there's arguments too made, as you probably know, that we need to drink milk because that's calcium. You know, plants have all the protein we need and better protein. Cow's milk has a lot of calcium, but we can get a lot of calcium from other substances too. So animal foods have no nutrients in them that we need, none. So we have been a society of humans, whichever country, it really doesn't make any difference. We're all told the same thing. And we live by what our parents sort of said. They have been thinking this way. This idea has been around for, you know, 100 and 200 years. one of the first people in science that I was impressed with who understood this was Pythagoras in Greece. He, in Western literature, Pythagoras, I've read quite a bit about Pythagoras, that he was a total plant-based consumer. And so he's still to remember for that. And of course, Aristotle said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine. I mean, the Greek philosophers had a lot of good things to say. And I don't know whether present day Greeks agree with their ancestors or not, but I certainly respect what they said.
Many people agree with that, but practice is the everyday practice of good nutrition is difficult. In principle, almost everybody agrees, but there is so much nutritional confusion that people really do not know what to eat. And at this point, I would like to ask you a question about the protein content of the diet. For example, if you have a diet of 20% protein, but this protein is a plant protein, but mixed in a way that it resembles the animal amino acid profile. So I guess it can be used in the same way as the animal protein.
That is absolutely correct. First off, I need to say that science established the amount of protein we need. They established that many years ago, about 1940 in the United States. And the amount of protein we need is about 10% of total calories. All plants have at least 10% protein. Even potatoes, just a little bit less, maybe 8 or 9%, something like that. But plants have all the protein we need. And so what happens, and so we can consume plants, we can consume up to maybe 15% or 20% protein from plants if we just, for example, consume legumes, high protein foods that have plants that have high protein content. We can get up higher, but that doesn't make any difference. I'll show something more on that later. Mm-hmm. Plants provide all the protein we need, and they provide a lot of other nutrients that animal foods don't even have, like the antioxidants and all the fibers. That's not present in animal food. So what I'm saying, I'm really confident of this, that the evidence really clearly shows that we do not need to eat animals. And this is a really important consideration for third world country development, as you are interested in, I know. I mean, I worked in that area a lot too. The developing countries where there's a lot of poverty and so forth and so on, they've got to get out of their heads that they need to have meat and food is typically consumed in the West. They should focus on their own gardens, their own food production practices, and so forth, and just work towards consuming a plant-based diet. That's all they need to do.
Just a hypothetical question. You have somebody who is quite wealthy, and they can eat whatever they want. You have somebody who is undernourished in terms of calories. Who do you think will be worse off if they increase the amount of animal foods in their diet? The undernourished or the wealthy person?
The wealthy people, they're the ones that are going to pay the biggest price. Because if you look at the life expectancy, for example, I can cite you specific figures in the United States. When the United States is compared with other the Euro countries, for example, we are in last place now in terms of life expectancy. We use the most drugs. We consume the most protein. So the United States is a good example of what not to do, is what not to do. And so I don't know whether I answered all your questions or not, but among other countries, let's say in Africa, Asia, so forth, yeah, there's childhood poverty, there's more malnourishment, that's true. But that problem there is more of a, in my view, a socioeconomic, has a socioeconomic foundation. There's not enough money, they can't produce enough food, and these children are actually deprived of enough food, any kind of food. You know, they're calorie deficient, that's the problem. And oftentimes I saw this, for example, in the Philippines and elsewhere, you may have seen something similar. What they were doing in Asia, the children who did get some food, still very malnourished, all they had was rice gruel, you know, rice porridge, maybe something like that. Sometimes maybe a little coffee dumped into it or something silly. And those children were very malnourished. They just didn't have enough food to eat at all. And the food they were consuming was just very minimal, no vegetables. They almost had no vegetables. And also in those areas too, because of poverty, the hygiene conditions, you know, in those communities is not so good. So the young children are exposed to infectious diseases, parasites, for example, and so forth, that basically put them at risk. So being the poor families will suffer the most in the sense that the children die earlier. I know in Haiti, the number of children that 50% of the children died before the age of 5. And that's one of the poorest countries in the world. It's one of the countries I worked in. So childhood malnutrition means childhood death rates being much higher. And so that pulls in the total life expectancy down.
Okay. Would you like to go on with your presentation?
Yeah.
And
Okay.
have some more questions?
Okay, I will. I'm going to minimize my little pictures here. Okay, is this okay then? So now I want to speak to the question concerning some of the questions we just heard, we just discussed. You know, what is the history of this protein question? Because, you know, most people, as we've just been talking, actually have a very high respect for protein, supposedly. I had an opportunity to go back into the literature in the 1980s when I spent a year at Oxford University in England. And so I went into the literature to try to understand, where did we get this fascination with protein? And it turns out that the man who first discovered protein in meat, by the way, it was in meat being fed to dogs. His name was Gerhard Mulder. And you can see he was born in 1802, died in 1880. But he was feeding meat to dogs in an experiment, I guess. And he found out that if they didn't have the meat, they would die or they'd get sick. So he wanted to find out if there was some way chemically, and this is in the early days of chemistry, he wanted to find out if there's some way he might discover something in the protein that might be, I mean, something in the food, in the meat. And he finally discovered this product, this chemical in the product that he realized was the essential part of meat that allowed the dogs to live. If they didn't have this, then they died. And that substance was named after, as we talked before, Anastasia, that was named as the Greek word, proteos, meaning prime importance. So the question I have for myself is that why did this gentleman here decide that he wanted to name this unnamed chemical? He wanted to name it something that really indicated that it was extremely important. And so he chose the Greek word proteos and he gave the name protein. So the word protein really comes from the Greek. So then, so the question is why? Why did you do that? I'll talk about that in a moment. But in any case, this whole idea of fascination, I should say, fascination with protein, has been, almost everybody in the world thinks that, we have to have the animals to get the protein, the high quality protein. And I'm just showing some pictures here. This is what we have today in the world. We have massive, factories, animal factories, producing either milk or meat, pork or chicken. I mean, it's really incredible what we have done, just because of this fascination that we humans have for eating meat, which is not quite right. One of the things I've noticed on the internet these days is that even though we now realize we don't need to eat meat, the rest of the world, most of the people in the world still think we need a lot more meat. And in fact, on the internet, the stories that I see mostly is how are we going to supply countries like China or India? How are we going to meet their needs for meat in the future? Somehow they simply don't realize we don't need the meat. And of course, there's that question, how can we produce more animals is a really silly question. It will only cause more disease and more problems. To illustrate the point, I'll turn to the United States and compare, in this case, the US with other Office of Economic Cooperation in developing countries. These are mostly European countries, not all, but mostly. And you can see here that in terms of the use of pharmaceuticals, in the United States, we have this idea that, we get sick, we have more heart disease, we have more cancer, we have more of the old age diseases, but but we also have access to drugs, because a lot of people believe, oh, that's okay, we can take care of these problems through the use of pharmaceuticals. So the United States is number one among these countries in terms of the amount of money we spend on the use of pharmaceuticals. I'm looking here for Greece. I don't see it here offhand. Oh yeah, there's Greece. Yeah, they use some drugs in Greece, obviously, right there. But the US is number one in terms of use of pharmaceuticals. We're also, eating the most animal protein, animal foods too, at the same time. In the United States, is also, I want to offer this for people living in other countries, because we're doing something here that, again, illustrates how not to do it. We're the only country in the world who advertise drugs on television. I'm talking about prescription drugs. This is a horrendous problem. I don't know why we are quite so stupid, but the total budget for our television now, the total budget, 74% is the latest figures I saw. 74% of the total TV budget is actually provided by pharmaceutical companies. So pharmaceutical companies have become extraordinarily powerful here in the United States. We use a lot of drugs, we advertise, everybody hears how good they are, but yet at the same time, they're also responsible for death. The third leading cause of death behind heart disease and cancer is the side effects that comes from the use of drugs. There's another listing that's number 4, but whether it's number 3 or number 4 is kind of, it's iffy. But in any case, we get side effects from drugs. And the interesting thing is that our government doesn't want to pay attention to this because the pharmaceutical companies are much too powerful to allow that to happen. So here's our life expectancy. Again, comparing the 39 OECD countries, we are, you can see if we spend all that money on drugs and we eat all that animal protein, the argument would go, well, maybe we should be healthier. No, we're not. Our life expectancy is way down here. And another recent study by the Commonwealth Fund suggested if we compare the US and taking out the other countries, the poorer countries, we're in last place among the wealthier countries. I'm looking here for Greece. Here's Greece right in the middle. It has a higher life expectancy than does the United States. So my question is, what's this rationale for drugs? Why do we eat the wrong food and get sick, and then in turn rely on drugs to make us well? It's a model for misdevelopment. It's asinine that we have taken this approach. We prefer drugs over food because I'm going to argue drugs make a lot more money. And that's part of the problem. So I end up considering nutrition in a very different way. As I say, nutrition is not about single nutrients doing single things. It's about all of them working together. Food has multiple nutrients working together. Each nutrient has multiple mechanisms by which it works. And these nutrients affect multiple diseases, multiple health improvements. So in order to make this extraordinarily complex field simple for the average person, I say that all we need to do is eat the food in a whole food form as much as possible. And it should be plant-based. If we were to do that, I am convinced that we would control at least 90% of our illnesses, and maybe more. I'm going to skip through these. These are the books that I did. We'll skip through those in a moment, turn to something new to answer a question. Here's another representation I want to show here too. And that is that we have now today health problems, at least in the United States. And I keep referring to the United States, my country, because here our health is illustrates the problem more than any place else, I think, in ways. Also, we have environmental problems, and we could talk about health problems and we could talk about environmental problems in terms of all these different categories. Our health problems include a high healthcare costs. We have drug side effects. We have shorter life. We depend on prescription drugs. We have high disease, etc. I can add more. These are just 6 of them. Over here in the environment issue is very important, as many people are now beginning to know. We have climate warming, topsoil loss, the deep water aquifers, the water deep down under the ground is beginning to disappear. Good example of that in the United States. That comes from the grazing of the land with livestock. Species loss, forest. Now, all of these things here, environmental, human, we tend to think of each of these have their own individual causes. No, they don't. I'm going to argue that among all these things here, there is basically one cause, one main cause. There's lots of other causes too that you can consider, but there's one cause that's really predominant over all the others. I didn't mean to do that, but it's the eating of food. I'm going to go here to another question. Sorry, I didn't get this here arranged as well as I should. No, let me skip this here just for a moment. Okay, here's what I want to do here. We talked about high quality protein being present in animal proteins. And so I want to go back and consider with you the origin of this idea of high quality protein. It was an idea that was published in 1924, almost 100 years ago. And it really, as I pointed out before, it has to do with the fact that of the protein being consumed, a higher percent is retained. It's that simple. Just a very simple proportionality question. Of the protein being consumed, more is retained. And in those days, that in turn led to faster rate of body growth. That was considered to be important, obviously, for livestock. To get a faster rate of growth or a higher production of eggs and milk, for example, if we just fed more protein. But now we know something that the rest of the scientific world seems not to want to know, certainly politicians, namely, the higher the proportion of protein being retained, that also increases the production of growth hormone in our bodies. Growth hormone stimulates cancer production. It also increases the amount of blood estrogen. Now, estrogen is the female hormone. And so we measured this in this large study we did in China. Women or young girls in this case who consume more animal-based food or higher animal protein, they have higher circulating levels of estrogen. Okay? That means they have a higher risk for breast cancer. Higher circulating levels of estrogen has been independently shown to be a higher risk for breast cancer. It also means something else too. Higher levels of estrogen means earlier age at menarche. In other words, the reproductive cycle starts earlier in young girls. More estrogen, earlier start, menses, later menopause. So the Western woman, the Western girl, woman, they have many more years of producing high levels of estrogen. This in turn relates to breast cancer, uterine cancer, and so forth. Also in boys, it's higher levels of testosterone tend to relate to more prostate cancer. We showed that before. So the protein is considered high quality. It retains more of the protein that makes more estrogen, makes more testosterone. Another thing that higher protein does, it increases the production of free radicals, oxygen free radicals. These are very reactive compounds that are used very carefully by the body to kill foreign pathogens in our body. But in reality, they also get increased just by the consumption of animal protein. That in turn speeds up the production of or the growth of cancer cells. Higher animal protein increases cancer mutations. It decreases these two things I've mentioned before, the two things that we'd like to have high, natural killer cells and DNA repair. So this idea of higher protein being retained, high quality, is nonsense, because yes, it increases growth rate, which is not that good of an idea. And then at the same time, it also increases, for example, cancer. Higher animal protein, higher quality protein also increases blood cholesterol, which in turn increases heart disease. Higher protein being retained increases blood sugar, and another indicator of diabetes. So here, the high quality protein increases cancer, increases heart disease, and increases diabetes, among other things. Today, in today's science world and in the political world, in fact, too, this is never told. The only thing that we tend to remember is we have to have protein, and we should have high quality protein from animals. And of course, as that young lady said on the question, why do we have this attitude? Well, it's very old. It goes back a long ways. As I said, at least 100 years, even more than that. So in reality, we don't consider that. Okay, I'm going to stop here now, see if there's any more questions.
Thank you. To sum up what you've said, it seems that although we have the evidence for the mechanism going from animal foods and animal protein to major diseases such as cancer and heart disease and diabetes, we don't actually use this in policy and in nutrition guidelines. So I would like to students and our guests to give their questions on what you said so far. And do I see any hands? Nicoletta.
I would like to ask, how could the new generations be educated in a healthier way of life? And if you think that schools are the one that should introduce their children to that way of life, or it is parents' responsibility to do it?
Well, this kind of diet is good from the day we're born. It should be introduced immediately. In other words, breast milk is the best food, obviously, for a young child when they're born. And of course, when breastfeeding is coming to an end, then at that point in time, the child should be introduced to plant-based foods. That's really important, not only for their own health, but also it basically allows these young baby or young child to become accustomed to the taste of this kind of food. And therefore, they're much more likely to stay on it for the rest of their lives. So it's really important that this message be brought to the attention of mothers who are having children, as well as, for their older children as well. It works for all ages. It really works for all ages. And the sooner, the better.
Parents in general that do not have the access or in all these informations that we have and we're doing in this course, and they don't have the access. Do you think that government should have a policy to give them the knowledge or help them to follow a healthier way of life?
Yes, that's of course a very good question. I mean, I know that's a question you're particularly interested in. Yeah, I have been working on this question for quite a long time personally, because I was involved in national policy development, both in the United States as well as internationally to some extent. And in the United States, if I could use the US example to illustrate my point, here we have a healthcare system. It's kind of like a private care system. We spend the most money. It's very heavily dependent on the corporate interest, I should say. I know in Europe it's more socialized. Government has more of a hand on that. But in either case, whether it's the European countries or the United States, for example, the one thing that the problem we have here is that the corporate sector has too much influence. Much too much influence. And so the guidelines that are produced, for example, here reflect the politics of the day. And so we unfortunately have a major decision at the level of the government that corporations can actually put in money to help elect politicians. And of course they do that. So the politicians are very responsive to corporate interest. Now, having said that, on the one hand, I also should say too, that in the United States, and I think this is generally true to some considerable extent in Europe as well, medical schools don't teach nutrition. And the reason they don't teach nutrition is because of the concentration that all of it seem to have on quick solutions. In other words, we tend to think, and that's why I was talking about single nutrients, a single this, a single that, because they make money. We can focus on one chemical doing medical work, whether it's a drug or whether it's a single nutrient. If we can focus on that, and then we can protect that ownership, if you will, by intellectual property laws, then of course we can make money with it. So what happens in our Western countries, there's too much influence, too much power exercised. In different countries it'd be different ways, but too much power exercised by those who are interested in the corporate sector. And one of the best ways to make a lot of money, as I'm sure you recognize, is to sell products that supposedly help our health. I mean, of all the products that can be sold, products that supposedly help our health is easy to sell because everybody wants to be healthy. So we, for example, here in the United States, we sell drugs because supposedly that makes for health, when that's simply not true. But talking about personal health is a tremendous attractant, to getting money and developing a business. So we don't train our doctors in nutrition. They get no training in nutrition, really. Because nutrition is a holistic effect. All the nutrients are working together. It's very cheap. We don't need to produce a lot of drugs for people to take. All they need to do is learn how to produce the food that they should be eating, to produce it locally. And it used to be that way in the older days. I think in the modern day, we can actually work out systems by which this food can be produced, either in local private plots or elsewhere. So we don't teach nutrition. That's one thing. The second thing, in the United States at least, we don't pay doctors for giving nutritional advice. First off, they're not told what nutrition is. Secondly, they're not properly reimbursed to give that kind of advice. That's the second issue. The third issue is that in the United States, once again, I'll use the US as an example. In our research institutions that provide the money for research, that's the National Institutes of Health, NIH they call it. They were the ones that funded my research for many, many years. And I've been very closely involved with them. There are 27 different national institutes, one for heart disease, one for cancer, one for this, one, so forth. There's not one called Institute of Nutrition. So here in a very capitalistic country like as we do have here in the United States, but it also applies to a lot of European countries too. What happens, we have very little respect for what nutrition can do. We would rather depend on creating nutrition by selling drugs or by selling special food products that supposedly have special properties, focused on one nutrient or whatever. So we are, I know I'm saying something that's very provocative, and a lot of people get upset by this, but we have to make a choice. Do we want to spend our money to create human health and happiness? Or would we rather spend our money on making a lot of money for certain individuals? That's the question. Those who are making lots of money are also the ones who tend to control the politicians. At least in this country, they control who gets elected and who don't. So it's the rich that controls the information. And I can assure you, they're not particularly interested in informing the rest of society about how to eat healthily, because that takes away a lot of their business, if you will. I know I'm saying a very harsh thing, but that's what the science shows me.
So what you say in effect is that people, individuals, are the only ones who have the power to change, the industries and what's happening. Yeah.
That's to a large extent, that's true what you just said. And unfortunately, we as individuals don't have enough power to do that in a sense, because the power, as you know, is hooked to the who has the money. So the only imaginary solution that I can even think of is we've got to somehow exercise our voices and get this information out before the public at large. One of the things I'm learning myself, and I spent some time, as you know, and worked in national policy development. So I know that game reasonably well. One of the things I discovered when I wrote the book, The China Study, that came out in 2005, at that time, I did not know whether that book would sell. Because I wanted to write a book on diet and health that was, first off, it had to be scientifically sound. So I had a lot of references. I had 750 references. And the second thing, I wanted to be able to write a book that the public would understand, and so they could try it for themselves. I was at that time kind of, I don't know, depressed and thinking that, it wouldn't, somehow the book would not sell. It would not sell. Well, it turned out that the publisher told me that if I should take out the references, I should put recipes in there, so forth. He said, you won't sell it. That's all the public wants to hear. So I was led to believe this not going to sell. Actually, it turned out now it's sold close to, counting its offspring, 4 million copies. It's been translated into 50 foreign languages. That's 50 foreign languages around the world. What that tells me is that the public at large is very interested in having good health. I think that's reasonable to assume. But they haven't heard it before. So, how do they learn about it? And that's what, at least in my case, I come down to arguing that doctors need to be trained because they're the primary health, caretakers. They need to be paid more, at least adequate income. And we just need to get out the information to the public.
Yep. I would like to call Spiros so that he gives us one of his questions. Spiro?
Γεια σας. Hello.
Not the Spiros, the other Spiros.
Other Spiros. Sorry.
For the moment, for now. Spiro?
Hello, sir. I'm not able to use my camera. I apologize for that. I'm attending from a hospital. So as a beginner, I would like to thank you for being here with us. As regards my question, during one of your lectures back in 2018 with topic, why is the science of nutrition ignored in medicine? It was said that whole plants food nutrition prevents, treats, and cures a wide range of disease and illness with little or no side effects, unlike drug therapy. In many cases where a person suffers from many different diseases, by relying on a single chemical drugs, let's say, it is difficult to keep the balance, as we have to look for more than one mechanisms to interfere. Usually, the medical doctors prioritize the issues we are facing in order to provide the relevant medication, even if by using this medication, we then negatively affect the condition of other problems. So my question is, are we allowed to claim that nutrition is the key? So by the use of nutrition means, will we avoid making worse a medical issue in favor of another?
Well, yeah, your question is very good. I understand. And I'm going to try to answer the question and say, yes, when I compare what nutrition can do compared to, let's say, what drugs can do, nutrition is vastly superior because the evidence clearly suggests that not only do we have longer lives, even more importantly, we live longer without disease. I mean, in the United States, again, use my own country as an example, people who are 80 years of age and older, I think the latest figure is something like 90 or 95% of people older than 80 years of age have already been diagnosed with heart disease, cancer, diabetes, or one of these autoimmune diseases. And so in the case of using nutrition and sticking with nutrition all one's life, we tend to avoid those. The differences are remarkable, not perfect. Nothing is perfect. And so we occasionally might see a person eating quite well and still having a problem. And I don't know what the answer to that is. Maybe it's, overactive gene, if you will, or something of that sort. But in general, if we compare, there's no comparison between nutrition on the one hand and drugs on the other. Doctors are trained to use drugs. We as individuals, we're trained to eat food. And we can figure out how to do that if we just knew the information. So I'm going to argue that the future, if we're going to have a future in the world, we better eat the right food and then, have a longer life freer of the problems we're going to have. And at the same time, which I find really fascinating, the environmental problems we now experience or are talking about a lot, that's the number one cause of climate change and environmental problems is the raising of livestock, the tearing down of the forest, the disappearance of the water aquifers, soil loss, all those things. The primary cause of that is our relying on the consumption of the raising, production, and the consumption of livestock products. And we don't need to. We do not need that. That only just leads to more illness and the use of more drugs, if you will. And if we just change our understanding of this question and just eat the right food, we'd all be better off personally as well as socially, collectively.
If I understood well, you're talking about prevention mainly. What about reversal? Would would a plant-based diet with whole foods, without supplements or, processed foods, do we have evidence that this kind of diet works in a reversal as well?
Yes, that's a good question. It turns out that we have sort of known, sort of superficially, we have known that consuming more plants tend to prevent diseases from forming. But now it's really interesting, especially with this whole food plant-based idea. I find that the kind of diet that prevents these diseases from forming is the same kind of diet that reverses them. Let's say a person gets heart disease, let's say they have whatever, and they have the heart disease or they have the diabetes because they're eating the wrong food. I mean, that's true almost in every case. They're eating the wrong food. If we with those individuals, all of a sudden we start feeding them this kind of diet, we see changes within 1 to 2 days. Serum cholesterol drops like a rock. I mean, it's really amazing. Blood sugar drops quickly. And so we can actually reverse these diseases. So the nutrition that I'm talking about, that's the whole food plant-based diet. It has this amazing property of both preventing and reversing, or let's say treating these kind of diseases. I find that absolutely fascinating. And one of the reasons for I'm being so convinced of that is not only has it been demonstrated, especially by my colleagues, other colleagues who are in the clinical setting, Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Ornish, those names might be familiar to you, possibly, but they were able to show this remarkable reversals. And as long as people stayed on that kind of diet, then the disease did not come back. And I just find that so remarkable. And unfortunately, the physician community doesn't want to acknowledge that. They don't say anything about that because they'd rather use their drugs because it makes money. I'm not accusing individual doctors of this. That's not, they don't think like that necessarily themselves. I'm talking about the system within which they are part. It's the whole superstructure involving corporate interest, political interest, and so forth. And we're, essentially, we're all prisoners to that system.
Okay. I would like to Lefteris to ask a question, and then we will go to Eli Vintiadis.
Hi, thank you for your time and for your speech. I would like to ask you, first of all, what is the difference between plant-based and the vegan diet, or it is just the same thing?
Yeah, the vegan diet was started, actually, let me back up just for a second. The vegetarian diet was the first opportunity to talk about a plant-based diet. That occurred in the middle 1800s, vegetarian, okay? Unfortunately, the vegetarian diet also still allowed consumption of dairy. So it wasn't completely plant-based. It was, that idea was started because of ethical considerations, having consideration for the animals, not killing animals. That's a good that's a good reason, if you will, but it wasn't based really on science. The vegan diet then was introduced in about 100 years later in this country. I think it was vegan. That's 100%, no dairy, nothing of that kind. That was mostly ethical argument. Again, as I say, it's fine. I don't. My problem with those two approaches are basically two. First off, that's not why I have the ideas I do, because I was exactly the opposite. I was eating a lot of animal food, of course, and I was trained that way. So I didn't get my ideas from the vegetarian or vegan movement. And I'm the one that actually came up with the word plant-based in this country. And then later it was called whole food plant-based when I was working at the government level in this country. Now, you're asking the question, what's the difference between a vegan, vegetarian, and whole food plant-based diet? The vegetarian diet, as I indicated, still allows for consumption of dairy, and in many cases fish. They call it pescatarian diet, for example. The vegan diet wants no animal foods, is 100%. But the problem with the vegan diet is that they don't seem to understand the science very well. So what they do, they usually add back a lot of added oil and sugar, refined carbohydrates. That's what people like to consume. That we're addicted to that. And so the vegan diet and vegetarian diet too, the amount of sugar that the vegan diet or vegetarian, the amount of sugar they use, the amount of added oil they use is about the same as meat eaters. So the vegan and vegetarian movements, they're good movements for good reasons, but they were not based on science. And so as a result, I find trouble with them. And as I say, I wanted to come up with a different name and had the whole food plant-based diet, for that purpose. And I define that as a diet only, as close as possible to whole food. That does not, I do not mean you can't cook them, or raw food, whole food, cooked food. I'm just simply saying when we eat the food, we should try to eat the whole food as much as possible at the same setting. If we're eating leafy vegetables, for example, we don't need to take the fiber out of the vegetables and eat it separately. We just eat it all together. That's what I mean by whole. So it's very easy. And one more comment, which I've now seen many times over, and personally I've seen it too, is that a lot of people, when they start eating this way, they don't like it. They might even believe that, as they say, oh yeah, I understand, it sounds good, but I really don't like it. So they revert. And the question there is, if they stay on it for 1 or 2, maybe even 3 months in some cases, their preferences for taste change. And when your taste preferences change, then you don't want to go back. And that's what a lot of people don't do. They don't try it long enough to realize that their taste preferences change. So vegetarian, vegan diets are okay, but there's too much salt and sugar, fat. In some cases, still using dairy, whereas a whole food plant-based diet doesn't allow that.
Okay.
Okay, one more question, please.
Shall we go to Ellie first and then we come
okay, no problem. Yes, okay.
Ellie and then Natalia, and then we go to Lefteris.
Yes, hello, and thank you very much for this wonderful talk. You talked about the environmental effects of eating animals, and I mostly agree with you on everything you said. But I was wondering, do you think that the fact that we're almost 8 billion people on this planet, isn't that the problem in itself? Having to feed that many people, is a vegetarian option really something viable for us? Or would you accept something like a flexitarian option where we eat a bit of meat, not too much? Maybe, because I'm thinking that maybe that's both for health reasons and for ecological reasons, maybe that would be an option, maybe even a more viable option than turning everyone turned vegetarian or vegan.
That certainly is a very good option. In fact, that idea is now becoming a little bit old almost. Yeah, population control is an issue. And so that's number one. But number two, keep in mind that the amount of land that's required to grow animal food is, like 10 times, depending on which kind of food you're talking about. But it's a huge difference between the amount of land required to grow the same amount of nutriment for, if we rely on animals compared to plants. If we just eat plants, then we all of a sudden have large amounts of land that become available for growing that food, for getting the same amount of food and better food at that. So we, in theory, could allow even bigger populations, although I also happen to agree with your sentiment that, we should keep population we should be concerned about population control. We don't need to, we should work on that. I don't agree though with what you suggested that a flexitarian kind of thing. In other words, if people want to change their health, and that's the main reason that people, I think in large measure, they use the food they do. If they want to change their health and they only want to go part way, that's not going to accomplish very much because for one thing, they revert back to what it was they were doing before. And so the flexitarian diet is in principle, almost philosophically, I guess, you could argue that's a good road to travel. But for practical reasons, it's better just to go ahead and do it. And incidentally, when I say 100%, or I'm inferring 100%, you know, if people slip a little bit, that's I can't say it makes much difference. But the point is that if you really want to stay on this, you really do have to go. You have to be on it long enough to know that when you get there, you don't want the other food. You can actually get away from consuming the animal foods and stuff like that because that no longer tastes good. That I would say, let's put the message out there, and let people decide for themselves. I am not the kind of person that should. Yeah, I don't like to have things dictated. I don't like that. And so we should still leave people to choose. But the most important thing of all is to give everyone the proper information and let them then make wise choices for themselves.
Excellent. Thank you, Ali, for this question. We go to, I would like to add 2 bits of information. Of course, population is a big problem, the level of population. This is what I'm doing in my research. I'm researching that. And it seems that we are well over what would be sustainable with the current dietary practice. I don't know yet what level would be sustainable if everybody went vegan. But what I can say is that we would need 75% less land to grow nutritious food. These are the data I can share with you right now. Shall we go to Natalia? Natalia and then Nicoletta.
Hello to everyone. Thank you, Mr. Campbell, for your speech. I would like to ask you, how can someone reduce his environmental footprint by adopting a vegan diet? And last but not least, is somebody able to get all the necessary nutrients for his organism through it? Some people are confused with this idea. Thank you.
Well, first off, as far as getting all the nutrients that we need from plant foods, the answer to that is yes. The important part of that question, or answer, I guess I should say, when we're consuming a plant-based diet, we really should use variety of food. So if one food maybe is a little bit lacking in a particular nutrient, then it's easily covered by another food. In other words, when we're eating leafy vegetables, there's many different kinds of leafy vegetables. When we're consuming fruits, obviously many different kinds of fruits. And when we're consuming grains, there are different kinds of grains, although I would argue that we should probably stay with the whole grains rather than the refined grains. As long as we're sort of using a variety of foods, then we don't need to worry about whether or not we're getting certain nutrients. The reason that you said there's a lot of people are confused, and that's true. A lot of people are confused. The reason that they're so confused is because the authorities, and I'm including scientists like myself and government authorities also, we have too much talked about individual nutrients as to having special properties. And when we start talking that way, biology is so complex that everybody can almost find something wrong with every nutrient or something right with every nutrient. And so it's a very confusing state of affairs. that's why I'm saying that one way to reduce the confusion is not to talk so much about individual nutrients, sometimes individual foods. Just eat a variety of foods of all kinds. And that variety of foods to be consumed are going to be different in different countries, that's for sure. But there's no problem with that either. In Africa, they're more likely to want to consume camote instead of potatoes, for example, or South America is potatoes, Asia is rice, so forth and so on. But that doesn't change the equation, because all those foods, whether it's one kind of grain or cereal grain in one country and another, that doesn't make any difference. So they should not be confused about that. Just consume the foods that they enjoy, particularly in their own society, and we'll all get the same benefits. We'll all get the same benefits as long as we have, some fruits in our diet and some leafy vegetables. Leafy vegetables are very good. Legumes are very good, by the way. Beans and so forth. And any kind of fruiting bodies of the plants, it's good. So I'm well aware of the concern that the questioner said about the confusion. So many people are confused. She is so right. We are so confused. And I would argue that the main reason we're so confused because we all have our own favorite little detail to talk about, when in reality, let's stop worrying about the details. Let's worry about the whole thing and just mix and match a lot. We're all in good shape.
It is 6:58. I think we should pack it up at this point. I would like to you to give us something to hope, to act upon. I know there are a lot of more questions, but the Nutrition Studies website, I'm sure, provides answers to most of them. But I would like to close this this lecture with some hope and some advice, let's say, for how the students, how individuals with in their capacity as employees or as business owners, what you could suggest they could do to facilitate this transition to whole food landscape.
That's a very good question. I think our program, our nonprofit program called Center for Nutrition Studies, that you took, incidentally, and others, we are now expanding that to include some groups around the world, actually, making small grants to different groups around the world who have ideas to work in their own communities to change things. And some people are working on projects to show how we can grow plants, even in urban settings or in small villages. In other words, people have lost touch with how to grow plants. That's one thing. Another has to do with how do we make sure that those who have less advantaged, are given an opportunity to have that kind of food. So I guess what I'm really saying is we're finding projects that work at the local level is really important. It might mean just holding meetings from time to time with the community, small community, getting together and cooking and sharing recipes and conversation and so forth. That's another way. And then maybe having listen to some lectures, education, I guess I should say. On a more macro scale, as I said before, we need to change the way doctors are trained and the way they are paid and the way we do research. That's on the macro societal level. But personally, I think it'd be just useful for people to get some books or get some videos. I've had some books, as you probably know, and maybe go to take the course and learn about this. if they're unsure of it, just spend some time learning about it and then trying it. One of the things that's happening here in the United States, I noticed is quite interesting. My oldest son has done this. Actually, my youngest son is a physician himself. They get a group of people and they provide the food for them, for let's say 10 days or 2 weeks. And at that time, everybody should stay with the diet. Don't veer off in different directions, but stay with the diet and measure things at the beginning and the end, like take blood samples, measure cholesterol, measure blood sugar if they have diabetes and so forth. They will see the changes and they can easily see what happens, and they also can feel the results. So I think there's a lot of hope here, and the hope is in the sense that we know enough how to create health, and it can apply to every person. That's the most important thing. It can apply to every person. So it's just a question of getting people sufficiently informed about the means by which they can do this. Maybe some people would want to work in the legal profession at the governmental level, and get changes made. And that's another way to consider working in this. But I think really the best thing is to just get familiar with information, learn that this idea really does work, and then learn in turn why it is we don't know it. That's another part of the story that needs to be told. We're being, unfortunately, greatly influenced by corporate interest for making money rather than interest to make health. So that's another issue. So I'm hopeful that we can do these things because we know how to do these things in a lot of cases. We know how to do these cases. We know how to do this in a lot of cases. And so, yeah.
That is wonderful. I think we have to. We don't want to, but we have to to put an end to this very nice meeting and your lecture. I would like to thank everybody who was here for their participation, and I would like to thank Professor Campbell for being so. For having, been so supportive to this course, course throughout the years, helping out. And I hope that we will soon meet again in class or outside the class with you and with the students and our guests. So with this, I have to say goodbye once more, and take good care of you, and hope you enjoyed this lecture.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Campbell. Bye-bye.